welcome back to another week. This is number 70. Continuing on, starting on Monday, I was looking at issues surrounding the enemy spawn. Well, not enemy spawn, but enemy controlling the enemies. I was continuing my work from last week and finishing up and polishing up the functionality around how to manage enemies properly without having to rely on situations and cases where the enemies are disabled merely by adjacent sector. That wasn't actually sufficient. So I moved to a more proximity-based solution, and and I kind of had to iron out a lot of the cases, and I had to restructure a couple things, and just did a lot of testing. This was one of the issues where another system that I didn't consider, but managing the number of enemies that are loaded and running on the CPU at a given time is pretty essential for performance. So um, I spent Monday kind of working on that and testing a bunch of stuff, and I spent Tuesday and Wednesday on it. As you can probably hear from my voice, I'm actually getting over a cold this week, so it was kind of I had to make up a day on Saturday to get my hours in for this week. But on Tuesday and Wednesday, I only put a half day in, and I was pretty under the weather. Had to recover, but um, by Tuesday and Wednesday, I was actually able to wrap up the functionality surrounding proper enemy disabling. So now it's a proximity based solution, so you can see kind of the range of the green player versus the range of. So there's certain rules and conditions. So if you're inside of a sector, all enemies will be enabled. But if he's outside of the sector you're in, like here, the enemy will actually activate, but they will not move around. They'll be in idle. They'll not be on patrol. They'll just be in like they'll active. So when you get to the room, they won't actually pop in, but only when you enter the room will they start their patrol or whatever they're assigned to. The part this week was more about the second part of the equation. What happens when you have an enemy alerted to you, and all the cases and conditions surrounding that. So let's just say one of these enemies is alerted to you and everybody starts chasing you through the sector, and so pretty much allowing functionality. How do you handle cases where the enemy chases you into another sector? Now I have to kind of restructure to make sure that there are certain situations where if you move throughout the sectors and enemies are chasing you, they're not really tied to the sector, and they won't get disabled as soon as the sector gets disabled. So I kind of had to move them out of the as a child of the sector, so they can actually not get disabled by the sector algorithm. They continue to chase you. And then other cases like, um, what happens when they lose you? They lose sight of you, and they're in a different sector. Like, how do you handle that? How do you properly disable them once they're outside of their original starting sector? Well, I had to, implement behavior to make sure once they lose you, they go back to they make their way back to their original waypoint eventually. And at that point, if they go out of range, what will happen is um, they'll be disabled, but the marker will be set back to their original sector. So if you know, that way, they'll be disabled if they go out of range. If you follow them around and you're still within range, they won't be disabled. You could follow them all the way back to their original starting point in their sector, but um, essentially it just, makes sure that they're going back to patrol, and if you go out of range, then it'll be disabled, and they'll pretty much jump to their starting point. And so all the functionality, doing testing around that, and I got it looking pretty decent. For all sorts of things. And just to be safe, I went back and tested situations like reloading and and then the enemy spawn system for regular spawn enemies. To make sure that all that was working properly and whatnot. So Tuesday and Wednesday wrapped that up, and I was ready to kind of move on back to sector optimization work. And I started in on this next scene since I got done with the last scene last week. So this this scene was a smaller scene, and so a little less work to do. Just basically 3 sectors. This one was the biggest, and I kind of had to do a lot of stuff with the background stuff, but basically the same process of sector optimization. Not too much to talk about there, just, you know, a lot of work, but just the same that I've been doing up until now. Just and then these 2 smaller sectors here had to go through my checklist and make sure everything's working right. And then I eventually going to let's see, all the way to Thursday, I was able to get the scene 2 pretty much all optimized and ready to go. From where I left it off, it's pretty much all the shadows are baked. It's, you know, it's running performant, and all the enemies are set out in their basic patrols and ready to go. So I was ready to start moving on to the next scene, which is scene 3, which is a bigger scene. So I'll go ahead and load that up, and then we can see and talk about what I did for the last portion of the week. So for the last portion of the week, I was working on this um, next scene, focusing on the first 2 sectors. I tackled this first sector here, which is this hallway in this room here, and then there's a little bit of overhead for a new scene. I had to add. I'm getting a process for adding light tiles and enemy spawn tiles, and I have to validate to make sure that works at some point. But I was able to do the optimization pass for this first scene here. It's looking pretty good. Um, Seems like the shadow casters and everything are broken right now, but um, I'll give another preview what it looks like when it's all finished. But needless to say, this sector here has been done all the way up to, and then I moved to this other sector, which is a much larger sector. There's a lot more complications with this sector here. I began the sector optimization process to a certain point until I got to adding enemies and patrols for this sector. Um, that's when I kind of took a diversion. I wanted to add a couple more enemies to the roster, and I chose these 2. I chose this. I chose this. Let's see if I can turn them around here. Scene. I chose this guy here. He's a let's turn him around. He's like a they call it a Hellcat or whatever. He used to be twice as big, but I found that he was kind of too big for this environment. He kind of runs around and he gets stuck on a lot of things. He can't really. And this kind of led me to another thing where I had to remember how to do a certain thing, which is a multiple nav mesh area baking. So larger enemies, they can't go everywhere. Like they can only, because they have to have more space, otherwise they get caught on obstacles. So there's kind of 2 different areas now, for one for smaller enemies and one for larger enemies. So I kind of remembered and figured out how to get that done. Um, but anyways, I spent time like I did before, adding basic functionality like the idle, the patrol walk, and then the run when chasing, just basically, and setting up a custom care, enemy controller for each one of these. Like I usually do that, I can go and fill out custom behavior now that I have my enemy's foundation. So this new character is a melee character, no shooting, but this one is a humanoid ranged character. He'll be able to shoot his rockets at some point, and then also maybe jump around, fly around, things like that. So um, got that working. Took some time to do, and then the last thing I wanted to do before I continued on with the optimization sector, I wanted to build the functionality to add these sort of turret kind of things, right? Before we can kind of take a look here and see. Before it was just it was kind of a hacky bit. I had a previous just a turret, and I slapped it on this other model, this spotlight, and it kind of looked janky. There was like this handle going through the turret, so I had to go in Blender and make a quick little edit and figure out how to like modify the model real quick, so it kind of looked a bit more clean. And then what I did was I took my functionality based off the working security camera that I had before and kind of went through the process of abstracting the common behavior like detection and alerting and all that common stuff, and abstracting it out so that I could apply it to and then extend the functionality to turret, right? Because it has additional functionality like being able to shoot and things like that. But essentially the same functionality, rotating, spotting, things like that. So um, I would like to demonstrate the alerting functionality, but that's kind of where I ended the week, where this is kind of a different setup here, where the camera, you can do a simple rotation off of like a one axis, and that's simple, and that works for that. But this kind of setup with this model, it kind of works a little differently, where it has a two-axis rotation, one here and then one here, right? And in theory, you're able to track targets, with a two-axis, right? That's all possible, but in practice, implementing with AI, it gets a little bit tricky and it gets into the weeds. And I was having some success, but I couldn't really nail it completely. I got it mostly working right correctly for like this upright vertical position. It was looking pretty good, but then I wanted to kind of make it work for some situation like this where you set it up in the horizontal position. If you wanted it on a wall or something instead of like a stand. But that's when things kind of fell apart. You know, I was kind of getting into rotational algorithm hell again, and kind of going around circles. There's just something off with the ability to like track when it's in the vertical position and all the orientations, the pivot orientations are all correct. It works properly for the most part, but once you flip it on its side, everything goes wacky. So there's something not working right. And also the other thing, I was testing it over here, but when I moved the vertical just to a different world orientation, all of a sudden it just completely broke. So there's something wrong with the overall algorithm that I'm gonna have to figure out next week. I'm sure I can figure out and get it working with a two-axis. A little bit more complicated, but when it is working, it looks pretty cool with the two-axis rotation. And then the next step is obviously to make sure that it can track, like acquire a target, lead a target, and hit a target with these guns. Bit of animation for the recoil on them, and then I'm going to use my spider bot weapon for the actual projectile. So it'll be pretty sweet. I'll be able to demo the final result next week, but we'll have a shooting turret kind of deal that we can add to levels and stuff. And yeah, so we'll finish that up next week. But that's pretty much where I ended up this week. So we'll finish that up next week, and then just go back to the rote task of finishing up this the optimization pass for this next scene. So that's pretty much all I have for this week. Still getting over the cold, but we'll we'll get it done next week. And thanks for tuning in. We'll check in with you later. See ya.